Speaker, thank you, Deputy Speaker. I do rise on behalf of the opposition to address the Financial Management Gender Responsive Budgeting Bill 2024. From the outset, Deputy Speaker, I'd like to, well, frankly state the obvious, that this is the first year that I'm aware of that this Financial Management Gender Responsive Budgeting Bill has been included as part of the government's budget bills package. Ordinarily, there would be the Appropriations Bill, the Appropriations Parliament Bill, the State Taxation Bill, and this year, for the first year, included as part of the budget bills package is the Financial Management Gender Responsive Budgeting Bill 2024. The government states that the Gender Responsive Budgeting Bill 2024 amends the Financial Management Act 1994 to embed gender-responsive budgeting into the Victorian budget. And while the government has been reporting on gender impacts for several years, this year, as I mentioned, will mark the first year that gender-responsive budgeting will become a legislated requirement. In undertaking some research to contribute at this point in time, Deputy Speaker, I did delve a little bit further into that, and I do understand that there is a department, an area within the Department of Treasury and Finance, the Gender Responsive Budgeting Unit, which has ordinarily, as part of their course, undertaken work to understand the impact, the gender impact of budgeting and on Victorians. This unit, as I understand it, develops new policies, programs and services with a gender lens to enable more inclusive design of budget initiatives. And in fact, DTF, being the Department of Treasury and Finance, have published gender equality budgeting statements since 2017, since the 2017-18 budget. And they've done so publicly, and it's been made available on the Department of Treasury and Finance website, the one in my hand being the first from the 2017-18 budget. Now, seeing as though, I think it's a fair question to ask, Deputy Speaker, that seeing as though this unit within the Department of Treasury and Finance has established the practice of providing a gender equality budget statement as part of the Department of Treasury and Finance's ordinary work in relation to the preparation and the aftermath of the Victorian state budget. It does beg the question, why is this new bill needed? And why is this bill now included as part of the suite of budget bills? And to understand that, Deputy Speaker, we need to understand two areas of work, two packages of work that have been undertaken. One because of the work of the Public Accounts and Estimates Committee, and the other being a report undertaken or commissioned by the Department of Treasury in Finance. In 2023, the Public Accounts and Estimates Committee, in their budget estimates report of October 2023, had a number of recommendations which they made in that report specifically for the Department of Treasury and Finance. The member for, the then member for Laverton, no, the current member for Laverton, Sarah Connolly, was the chair at that time. My colleague in the upper house, the member for Northern Eastern Metropolitan Region, Mr McGowan, was the deputy chair of the committee at the time. There were a number of committee members, including other colleagues, Mrs MacArthur of Western Victoria and Mr O'Brien of the member for Gippsland South. That Public Accounts and Estimates Committee report made a number of recommendations. Finding 112 was that the 2023-24 budget include $1 million over 2 years to continue the work of the Gender Responsive Budgeting Unit in the Department of Treasury and Finance. The finding goes on to say that the GRBU has recorded several achievements, delivering 2 budgets employing gender-responsive budgeting approaches and training almost 400 Victorian Public Service staff in developing gender impact assessments. Finding 113, Deputy Speaker, states that the 2023-24 budget includes one new performance measure related to gender-responsive budgeting, percentage of gender-responsive budgeting over gender impact assessment information sessions. Attendees who indicated the session helped improve their understanding of the GIA requirements. Recommendation 67, the Department of Treasury and Finance introduced the performance measure percentage of funding requests through the budget process that meet minimum gender impact consideration requirements in the 2024-25 budget, and recommendation 68 of that Public Accounts and Estimates report states that the Department of Treasury and Finance include further performance measures related to the outcomes achieved from gender-responsive budgeting, including the activities of the Gender Responsive Budgeting Unit in the 24-25 budget. So nowhere in either those findings, Deputy Speaker, nor the recommendations of the Public Accounts and Estimates Committee 2023 report does it state that there should be the establishment of a Financial Management Gender Responsive Budgeting Bill 2024, but it's just interesting to note the PAYAC's support for ongoing funding for the Gender Responsive Budgeting Unit and various other measures. I note that this report was one of unity. There was no dissenting report that I'm aware of by other members of that committee. So to understand, Deputy Speaker, the origins of the Financial Management Gender Responsive Budgeting Bill 2024, we do need to turn our minds, Deputy Speaker, to the Department of Treasury and Finance Commission report, Inquiry into Economic Equity for Victorian Women. This was a report commissioned jointly by the Treasurer and the Minister for Women at the time, and this report was given to both the Treasurer and to the Minister for Women for their consideration. The final report is dated January 2022. Deputy Speaker, recommendation 15 in this report states that calls on the government to embed gender-responsive budgeting in Victoria through legislation that secures and future-proofs the practice within government. And so there we have it, Deputy Speaker. There's the work of PAYAC, but there's also the report commissioned by the Treasurer and the Minister for Women, the Inquiry into Economic Equity for Victorian Women, final report of January 2022, which makes that recommendation. Deputy Speaker, I do note that the inquiry panel members for the DCF report commissioned by the Treasurer and the Minister for Women included Carol Swartz, AO, Liberty Sanger, OAM, and James Fazzino as well, the Chair and subsequent panel members. I think it's a curious mix, Deputy Speaker, of panel members. However, they delivered their report to the Treasurer and the Minister for Women, and within that report, as I've stated, contained the recommendation 15 that gender responsive budgeting be embedded in legislation to future-proof the practice within government. And so we are. So we are here today, Deputy Speaker, considering the Financial Management Gender Responsive Budgeting Bill 2024. The intended purpose of gender responsive budgeting is to consider and promote gender equality and inclusivity while developing spending and taxing policies. And each year, the government will be now legally obliged to provide a report on the gendered impacts of the budget. Historically, there was just a unit within DCF that of DCF's own steam published reports. Now there is a legislative requirement. Following the passage of this bill, there will be a legislative requirement. And the gender impact report on the budget must be tabled on or before the appropriation bills are moved for the second reading stage. Now, Deputy Speaker, while we do not oppose this bill brought forward by the government, The opposition is concerned that this legislation won't alleviate persistent gender inequality issues faced by every Victorian. We're seeing the result of a decade of financial mismanagement by the Andrews, now Allan, Labor government, and our read of the gender impacts of Labor's 10th budget is that with record taxes, record debt and now cuts to critical services, that all Victorians, whether they be women and girls, men and boys, will be worse off under this budget. Deputy Speaker, I don't say that lightly, as I addressed in yesterday's budget reply. In Labor's 10th budget, women's safety remains a key concern for us. There have been a record increase in sexual and indecent assault offences against women in our communities, and yet women struggle to access quality services, healthcare and law enforcement. New data by Respect Victoria shows that women continue to experience high rates of violence, pointing to a need for cultural change. The Respect Victoria data is as follows. Around 39% of women in Victoria have experienced physical or sexual violence since the age of 15, and around 26% of women in Victoria have experienced partner violence from a partner they live with, including emotional, physical, sexual and economic abuse. The Crime Statistics Agency is on the record as saying that family incidents recorded by Victoria Police, which disproportionately impact women, increased by 6.7% from 82,651 in 2018-19 to 88,214 in 2019-20, an increase of 5% in the rate of incidents per 100,000. So these are deeply concerning statistics for us, and on the back of that data and those hard data points that we have demonstrating the impact of gendered violence in this state, we would have thought that the government would have had a greater concern to funding a solution to that in this budget, and that doesn't appear to be the case. It could be asserted, and I will assert it, Deputy Speaker, that under Labor there are many Victorian women who continue to be let down. Now, if Labor genuinely wanted to improve gender equality in Victoria, they have started with more funding to public health, to police, to social services, but instead this latest budget, Labor's 10th budget, saw a number of cuts in every one of those areas. We also know that parents in Victoria are navigating childcare deserts and are unable to participate in the workforce. This is a burden that we know falls onto the shoulders of women more so than it does for men. I know my colleague, the member for Euroa, will be contributing straight after this contribution, and I'm sure that the member for Euroa will go into further detail about the impact on her community of childcare deserts, not only in her community but around the state. Currently, a lack of access to childcare takes almost 26,600 women entirely out of the workforce in Victoria and costs our economy $1.5 billion a year in lost earnings alone. This is a significant cost to women who are foregoing wages that could help them get ahead, as well as to our economy, which misses out on their productivity and their skills. It's worth noting that over 50% of women who say that they want to do more paid work say that lack of access to childcare, to affordable childcare, is the main barrier preventing them from taking on more hours. Frankly, Deputy Speaker, it's incredibly concerning that a 2022 study found that having a child opens up a 55% pay gap for Australian women in the workplace compared to their male colleagues in the first 5 years after childbirth. I know in my own family circumstance, my wife Kate has experienced such a circumstance. Lack of access to childcare services reinforces traditional gender roles. As women who may want to work are often obliged to stay home, either work part-time or take on lower paid jobs closer to home in order to look after their children. We must also acknowledge the benefits of early childhood for children, not just the economic or workforce benefits. The Mitchell Institute at Victoria University published what many would consider a first in a report which considers the impacts of lack of access to childcare. It's something which I've looked at in some detail. I'm quite impressed by the work of the Mitchell Institute at Victoria University, and it should be used to inform policy decisions when it comes to alleviating the pressures of all Victorians, especially when it comes to childcare deserts and oases, not only across Victoria but Australia. And last year, their findings were alarming. Around 9 million Australians, or 35.2% of the population, live in neighbourhoods they classify as a childcare desert, with the definition of desert being an area where there are more than 3 children per one available childcare place. There are circumstances around this state, Deputy Speaker, where the waiting list for a childcare place can be years, many years, and that is simply not good enough. The report highlighted how childcare is scarier in regional areas than metropolitan areas, and I do note the work of my regional Liberal and National colleagues in highlighting this challenge for families in the electorates that they serve. Deputy Speaker, this budget was about helping families. It's written on the front page of every budget paper, and it's not just women that make up families, it's also men as well. And my view is that not only women but every man has an obligation and has a duty to highlight inequity when they see it before them. And in making this contribution today, that is my intention, Deputy Speaker. When Labor say they're helping families, I ask the question, Deputy Speaker, how is it helpful to cut wellbeing support for school kids by $34 million, as we've seen in this year's budget? How is it helpful to cut early child sector support and regulation by some $79 million? How is it helpful to cut child protection by $141 million? If that's this government's version of helping Victorians, then we frankly have no interest in seeing their version of hurting Victorians. There were significant cuts in this budget, Deputy Speaker. In the lead up to this budget, we had been hearing that it would be a tough budget, that it would be a budget of cuts, but we didn't realise at that point the impact in the areas that it would cut. Ambulance services and medical research funding in this budget were cut. Community crime prevention and seniors programs in this budget were cut. Family violence and mental health support services in this budget were cut. And as I said yesterday, Deputy Speaker, I say it again today, these decisions to cut such programs, in my view, these aren't tough decisions through the lens of a tough budget. These are in fact cowardly decisions that potentially impact in the worst possible way many vulnerable Victorians around this state, many vulnerable Victorians who actually need a government to be investing more in services that protect them, more in services that take care of them, more in services that ensure their safety and their well-being. But sadly, through a number of cuts in this budget, I say that this government has in fact let those vulnerable Victorians down terribly. The Victorian Comprehensive Cancer Centre Alliance, for example, getting their funding cut, in fact, makes no sense whatsoever. And cuts to family violence support and mental health support in particular should deeply concern every Victorian. Through a gender-responsive lens, every Victorian, no matter your gender, uses a road. Every Victorian, no matter your gender, requires a home, a roof over your head. Gender does not discriminate when it comes to disability. Disability does not discriminate when it comes to gender. Every Victorian, no matter your gender, wants our tourism and major events program to be a thriving tourism and major events program. Now, every Victorian, no matter your gender, wants our creative industries in Melbourne especially, the cultural home of Australia, to thrive. Every Victorian, no matter your gender, wants there to be the best resourced youth justice services, the best resourced dental services, the best resourced aged and home care services, the best resourced public IVF services. But sadly, Deputy Speaker, in this budget, whether it be road maintenance, housing assistance, disability services, tourism and major events, creative industries, youth justice, dental services, aged and home care services, public IVF services, all of those services that, no matter your gender, Victorians rely upon, were cut in this budget, and that is not a good thing at all. In relation to IVF services, Deputy Speaker, as debt hits a record high, Labor have made cuts to public IVF services which will leave Victorians waiting longer for vital treatment. And as we know, IVF is a highly expensive and time-sensitive treatment, and as a result of Labor's cruel cuts, women and their families will suffer. That is an injustice. That is not right. That doesn't have to be the case. But sadly, Deputy Speaker, this is the price that Victorian women are paying for 10 years of economic mismanagement, 10 years of economic recklessness at the hands of a government that says that it cares, but in this case has demonstrated that it really, really doesn't. In relation to family violence service delivery, Labor's $29 million cut to funding for family violence services and further their cut to women's policy funding at a time when in the Victorian community women's safety is a concern for every Victorian. We've seen it, Deputy Speaker, not just in the Melbourne metropolitan community but in the regional community, and I'm thinking about some of the possibly preventable deaths of women in the Ballarat region. These family violence services that Victorians, every Victorian relies upon, may very well lead to lives being saved. And yet in this budget, this government has cut $29 million from family violence services. That is not going to be to deliver the best outcome for vulnerable people in this community, in our Victorian community. In the area of mental health, Deputy Speaker, Labor have also delayed the rollout of 35 local mental health and wellbeing hubs in this budget. These mental health hubs were recommended by the Victorian Royal Commission into Mental Health. Like you, Deputy Speaker, I remember wandering across the Carlton Gardens to the Royal Exhibition Building to hear the response of the work of the Royal Commission into mental health, commissioned by this government, and to hear from those who undertook that work on behalf of the Victorian people, on behalf of the Victorian government. I was at the time pleased that 35 local mental health and wellbeing hubs would be established, especially after the impact on mental health of the pandemic and the lockdowns that were experienced here in Victoria. Victorians need more mental health support now than frankly they've ever needed before. In my own community, I'm hearing reports from principals that still, after a couple of years since the pandemic ended, that they and their communities are facing difficulties in relation to mental health within their own student population and within the families within their school communities as well. So these mental health hubs, Deputy Speaker, were recommended by the Victorian Royal Commission into Mental Health, with 1 in 5 Victorians experiencing a mental health condition each year. Now is frankly not the time to be cutting mental health services in this state. and to, in fact, roll out community-based early intervention initiatives. Victoria lost over 800 lives to suicide in 2023, 5.3% on the year before, and 70% of these individuals who we lost were in fact men. I'd like to think that the bill we are considering today, the Financial Management Gender Responsive Budgeting Bill 2024, would take into consideration the impact of government policy making and government decision making, budgeting priorities, not just on women, but also on men, especially when we hear such tragic and impactful statistics as that. Frankly, Deputy Speaker, the government must do better. We must help individuals before they're at a crisis point, and rolling out the mental health hubs would have been the lifeline for so many Victorians. But sadly, that will now not be the case. In this budget, Deputy Speaker, we saw cuts to cancer research, and the budget also saw a 75% funding cut to leading cancer research in Victoria. With a growing and ageing population, the number of Victorians diagnosed with cancer is expected to increase from about 35,000 in 2022 to more than 50,000 in 2030. Cancer touches every Victorian, Deputy Speaker, as you know, as members of the government know, as members of the opposition know, as members of the crossbench know. Cancer touches every Victorian one way or the other. We all know someone who has been touched by cancer, whether it's a direct family member, whether it be a neighbour, a friend. Many of us in this place have lost loved ones because of cancer. If the government was going to cut anything, why on earth would they cut funding to the Victorian Comprehensive Cancer Centre Alliance? No matter your gender, Deputy Speaker, cancer does not discriminate. Cancer touches the lives of every Victorian in one way, often in tragic circumstances. And I would have thought that with this new bill that we're considering, following the recommendations of the Public Accounts and Estimates Committee, following the recommendation of the DCF report inquiry into economic equality for Victorian women, that when this government looks at things through a gender-responsive budgeting lens, that something that touches everyone, like cancer, research funding, would not be cut. Not cutting off critical funding that helps edge closer to a cure for cancer would be my request of this government. Deputy Speaker, in the short time that I have remaining, I simply want to say this. This budget historically had only 3 bills. We're now seeing the inclusion of a 4th, being the government's Gender Responsive Budgeting Bill. I've gone through the reasons why the government is establishing a Gender Responsive Budgeting Bill on the back of the work of the Public Accounts and Estimates Committee and on the back of the Treasurer and Minister for Women commissioned report, which made the recommendation that gender budgeting be enshrined in legislation, and that's why we're considering the bill before the Parliament today. But I do say this to the government, Deputy Speaker. No matter your gender, every one of us are Victorians, and every one of us, no matter your gender, is impacted by budgeting decisions that this government, and frankly any government, a government of the future, makes. Yes, I think it's appropriate for governments to consider the gender impact of their decisions on the Victorian community. But equally, Deputy Speaker, this government and future governments must also consider the broad-ranging, the broad sweeping impacts of their budget decisions on the Victorian community. And after 10 Labor budgets, after 10 years of Labor, and after the budget that was delivered last Tuesday by the Treasurer, the Premier's first budget, this is a budget of cuts to critical services, mainly impacting family, mainly impacting women, And frankly, my request of the government is that they do better, not just for women, but for men and for every Victorian.